So they say here, maybe I'm reading this wrong. It says, in other words, the saints who will be saved are represented as the animals. So they do kind of connect.
Contradicts.
They do kind of connect.
Contradiction. Yeah.
They do kind of connect the saints. They do say the saints are the animals.
So but then on the last page, they say it's the Gentiles.
Yeah. Well, I think what they're trying to say, and this is what I think that they're trying to say, is that, when he went up to heaven, he said, preach to the Gentiles, right? Preach to Samaria and all the earth. So the gospel's been open to the Gentiles. So those who receive the truth, those are the ones that are the Spirit and the bride are going to preach to the Gentiles, right? And the Gentiles are going to receive it and go to heaven.
Which is the members of the WMSCOG, basically.
Yeah.
Who are represented by the animals. And so you could say, though, then that
but it's actually
the saints are represented by both Eve and the animals.
Yeah.
Here.
Which
is interesting.
A whole another contradiction because they teach that, and I have notes from 6 Day Creation where they teach that, like, there's a difference between human and animal. Humans are those who have knowledge of God. Animals are those who do not have knowledge of God. And they use Psalms chapter 49, verse 20 to justify that explanation, that people who do not have understanding are those who are like beasts, like animals. So they teach that animals represent those without knowledge of God. But then here they say, and like you mentioned, in other words, saints who will be saved are represented as the animals. So that's actually a contradiction in their teaching, and members will recognize that.
I remember, I think probably the first conversation I sat down with members, and they did their Bible studies. One of the things they went to and put a really strong emphasis on was one of the parables about a wedding, where there was the wedding, and in that parable you had both the bride and you had the guests of the wedding, and so they emphasized
the bridegroom and the guests, the bride,
right. And there's places where they emphasize that, the I think it's in Revelation actually, maybe too, where you see the guests and the bride, and so they'll make this point that the bride can't be the guest to her own wedding, and basically what they're saying is, you can't have both of these symbols representing the church in the same setting. And so I would say to that, well, you guys have just done the same thing here in saying that Eve and the animals both represent the saints. In this same location in the Bible, you're saying that both Eve and the animals are representative of the saints. And so I'm not sure. I think I'd be interested to hear. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or if you see any holes in that. But when I came across that in this book, it just kind of stood out to me because I remembered how strongly they emphasized that point. And it seems I think
that's a really good point because, I mean, first of all, the Bible doesn't say Eve. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't say Eve represents anybody, right? And so their logic to pull that out. So they're saying, again, without any Bible verse, that Eve represents, the saints, and then also Eve represents God the Mother, right? But the thing is how this is different than the word lamb or the word bride, right? Because the word lamb and the word bride are actually like written down, and they have specific examples of where they go to in the Bible to say, hey, in this verse, lamb means Jesus, in this verse, lamb means God's people. But for Eve, they don't have specific places where they can go in the Bible and say, okay, in this case, Eve represents God the Mother, or in this case, Eve represents the saints. They're saying that Eve...
Well, finish your thought.
Well, they're saying Eve jointly represents the saints and also represents God the Mother. And I think that's an important point to... Oh, yeah, and the Gentiles, right?
I think, though, what they would do to support the Eve idea is they would go to places like, I think it's 2 Corinthians, where it talks, which this place doesn't work that I'm about to mention, where he says, Paul says to the church, I'm afraid for you that just as the serpent deceived Eve, so also your minds may be deceived. So they probably point to that. They probably point to the analogy between Christ and the church, where Paul says, as a father or as a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife and are made one flesh. So that's something Paul applies to the church and Christ, which obviously comes out of Genesis between Adam and Eve. And so I think off the top of my head, those are the only two places I can think of. But the 2 Corinthians one is not intended at all to make the church be a type of Eve. It's just a simple comparison. Like, he could have as easily said, I'm afraid for you that just as the serpent deceives Peter to deny Christ, so also your minds might be deceived. But if he did that, it'd be the same argument. But it doesn't mean he's saying that the church that Peter is a type of the church or something like that. Yeah. But so I think those would be the places maybe they draw from. There might be others, but I think ultimately that the fact that they get from that to a second deity, a second God, that's the issue. That's the real issue.
So they're doing it in two ways.
That says that they're using the verse in Romans chapter 5 verse 14 where it says Adam represents, a deity, therefore Eve, his wife, must represent a deity also, where it, again, doesn't say that.
But they're doing it in two ways, because in the first part of chapter 1, they're saying that the wife of the Lamb has two meanings, and they're basically saying, the bride of Christ, which is spelled out in Ephesians and in, 2 Corinthians 11, they're saying that the bride of Christ is not only the church, but it's also a female deity. And then they're doing the same thing with the Eve, saying it's not only, the church, it's also a female deity. So they're doing it both. And both times they're doing it, they're just kind of assuming what they're trying to prove with no basis to do it.